That's right, you read it correctly. Brass trimming considerations, part 4, coming up. Just when you thought it was safe to come back to the channel, here we are still talking about brass trimming. For those of you that are new subscribers to the channel, this should be a good lesson to you. When I dive into a topic, I fully intend to uncover every single thing about it that I can possibly use to my benefit to gain an advantage downrange. This brass trimming issue is no different than anything else that I work on in that regard. I'm always looking for the ultimate understanding that would allow me to get a little bit better performance in every particular aspect of what I'm doing. If I can grab 5% performance advantage in trimming, and then another 5% in priming, and another 5% in powder, another 5% in my brass handling in some other aspect, well then this all adds up to a significant amount of advancement. So all of these things must be addressed if you expect your rifles and your ammunition to shoot its absolute very best. And the real fun in this discipline comes from the advanced understanding of all of these different things. So now that we got that out of the way, let's get to the meat and potatoes of this episode, which is during trimming. You will often find yourself trimming, and this is if you do it in my prescribed manner, which I would tell anyone to trim every firing. Now, this is done as a matter of course in the best ammunition that I can create and best practices, but there's often times where I won't trim every firing. For instance, if I have a close range colony varmint rifle and I have 400 pieces of brass online for it at any given point in time, I will often skip firings. I won't trim every single firing. My primary goal is high volume and at relatively close ranges, and so when I am setting out to exterminate a prairie dog town, I will take some of this brass. I'll fire form brass in that scenario. I might not trim it for 3 or 4 firings. My main concern is volume of shooting and not so much the pinpoint accuracy. And so I'm shooting at targets that are relatively close and therefore much larger and much easier to hit. And so I wouldn't concern myself with it then. However, in the pursuit of perfection, well then yes, of course, I'm not going to leave any particular one of these variables behind, and I'm going to try to address as many of them as correctly as I possibly can, regardless of time or effort. Because you can't expect an apex level result if you're not willing to give apex level effort. And that's just the way the world works. And I know that's an uncomfortable reality for some of you out there, but it doesn't change the fact that that is indeed the truth of all of this. So for a moment, I'd like you to imagine yourself working at a brass manufacturing facility. And you're surrounded by all kinds of loud machines, and they're running at a blistering speed, hammering out brass. And for those of you that have never seen brass being manufactured, I would strongly recommend you go find a YouTube video that shows how this brass is manufactured. It all starts with a little cup. That cup gets smashed through a series of a ton of different dies, and all sorts of little operations are happening to it. We won't go into the detail here. I encourage you to find a YouTube video that outlines this process. But when you do, you'll be able to imagine yourself as an operator of one of these machines. Now you have to remember, a lot of the people that work at these facilities are not rabid precision rifle shooters. They may be shooters, but most of them would only be casually so, if that. And the vast majority of these people are just workers, folks. They're just guys going to a job, and they go to work, they punch the clock, they run the machine, they punch the clock, and they go home. And they don't really have any direct connection with what happens on our side of this arrangement. And so imagine yourself running one of those machines, and you would think from time to time, you know, some brass is going to end up maybe not necessarily where it's supposed to be, right? And depending on the company that's producing this brass, you might have some brass laying around, and maybe, you know, it'll be several hours during his shift before he even realizes that it's laying there. Well, he picks it up, and it looks like a pretty good piece of brass. Doesn't seem to be anything really wrong with it, so he'll just chuck it in the bin with the rest of the brass. And he won't necessarily care that the brass that he's running now is a different lot number because he had to make an adjustment on the machine, or he had to swap out a die or a punch somewhere along the process, swapped out a new bunter or something like that. So this operator, not knowing that the tiniest and smallest of variances in this brass that exists from lot number to lot number could potentially cause us to have a flyer, an unexplained round, a miss that sends a bullet somewhere other than where we were expecting, and there's no plausible explanation for why it happened. This type of thing happens at many brass manufacturing facilities, folks. This is not just something that you can't, I mean, you're thinking about it now, right, because I said it. If you imagine yourself there and you imagine that you don't really know much about precision rifle shooting, you can see how this could happen. Now, obviously, the apex level brass manufacturers for precision rifle shooters, companies like Alpha Munitions and Lapua, probably are taking more extensive lengths to make sure that this doesn't happen to us, right? I know for a fact that Alpha Munitions is taking a lot of steps to make sure that that doesn't happen to us. They are making specialty products for a specific class of shooter, and that's our class. The guys that are really obsessed with the tightest possible performances downrange. So these types of considerations have to enter your mind. You know, why am I talking about this on an episode about brass trimming? Well, it goes like this. That rogue piece of brass that operator chucked back into the bin of a different lot number, that shows up in our process, folks. And one of the easiest ways to find that piece of brass is during trimming. Now imagine you are trimming every firing in the prescribed manner that I recommend, and you feel just the slight little buzz. No matter what trimming tool you use to do your trimming, you get a feel for how much material is being trimmed off, and obviously you've measured a statistically significant number of your pieces of brass before you set your trimmer up, and as you go through, you're feeling how much material it's taking off. Now, when you first fire virgin cases, right, so 1 times fired cases, there might be a huge disparity in overall length and the neck bearing surface length, and you might end up trimming off all manner. There could be a 10,000ths variance there based on the complexities that I've mentioned in the previous 3 parts of this series on brass trimming. Well, your second firing comes around and you trim the brass, and it should be relatively stable after that because you're subjecting it to very controlled things. And because you've listened to all of my counsel on the previous videos on my channel, you're doing everything in a very uniform and predictable fashion. So you get to that second firing, or maybe your third firing, and you're running through your trimming operations, and you get a very strong feel, and you probably would only have a 0.5 or 1,000th variance between your fired cases. You fire them, you anneal them, you resize them, you tumble them, and now you're trimming them. And maybe just a tiny variance in all of those cases. And so you get a very, very good feel for what it feels like. And then you come across a piece of brass and it seems like you're trimming 1,000 feet off the thing, right? Have you ever experienced that before? Have you ever wondered what was causing that, right? One piece of brass that is way longer than all of the rest, that is indicative of a very specific metallurgical difference in that brass. Because it's one thing if you have this variance on your first firing or maybe your second firing. It takes anywhere between 3 and 6 firings on your brass before the brass is fully formed to your chamber and is totally stabilized. Now, how many firings this takes depends upon the quality of your components, how high of a pressure you're running in your loads, and the entire ecosystem really is at play here, right? The relationship between your chamber, your brass, and your sizing die. There's so many things that stack up. Your entire ecosystem will determine how uniform this brass is and how many firings it takes to get that way. The point is that once you've reached a certain level of uniformity, the subsequent firings from that point on will have next to no change in how the brass behaves. Well, that is not true if you have a piece of brass that is metallurgically different from the rest. So if it's different from the rest as a result of having different operations performed in a different way before it ever reached you, right? These are things that happened in the manufacturing process of this brass. And so you have no control over it. It's just what you've got to deal with. Well, when you're trimming, you can detect this stuff. After your brass is stabilized and you have a piece of brass that demonstrates that it has significantly greater flow than the rest of the brass, there's no telling what happened to it to cause it, but you cannot ignore the fact that that is happening. It's a real thing, and if you are aware of this, you can notice it, and then you can say, well, wow, that was strange, and you can take that piece of brass and cull it. Now, what was that weird word I just used? Cull? Yes, cull. C-U-L-L. Cull. This means to take a piece out of a batch and pull it out. Get rid of the thing that is not the same. When it comes to brass, we want to be extraordinarily picky. We want all of our little pieces of brass to be exactly the same, no differences, no changes, absolutely the same thing done to all of them at every step in our process, with no exceptions. Anything that's different means different downrange. That's how you need to think about this. If it's different anywhere in the case, meaning if you see something that looks different on the outside and you think that that might go through the material and it might be a flaw in the material, when the brass was being formed, some little contaminant fell off of the ceiling because they don't dust in these factories hardly at all, and somebody opened an overhead door and a bunch of junk flew off the light fixtures and landed on the equipment and mushed the dirt and dust and crud that fell off of the lights into the brass. You can see this stuff, folks. It's there for you to see. The biggest mistake that most shooters make is that they're so attached to their brass because they've spent money on it, when what you should be attached to is the performance downrange. You should realize that a difference in your brass, no matter how small or minute, if you're trying to shoot very small and minute, will make a difference. So you have to cull these bad pieces of brass. One of these things isn't like the others. One of these things is not the same. Yeah, it seems hilarious. You play that game as a kid, right? You find the thing that's different. Well, this is a very strong example of your skill sets as a child carrying over to adult life. And if you can find what's different about pieces of brass and get them out of rotation, get them pulled away from the batch of brass that you're using that you really care about its downrange performance, then you'll start to see a massive reduction in flyers. Again, most people's flyers are actually very easily attributable to something that they're not doing, cases that they should be culling that they're not. These types of things can be found during trimming. So if you've got a piece of brass that's flowing differently, oftentimes it'll bear out in a overall length discrepancy. So if you got 100 pieces of brass and they all are trimming about the same, but you've got like 2 that don't, well, that should be a clue. Those things are not the same. They're not behaving the same as the others. Now, you don't want to do this early. As I said, you don't want to do it first firing, second firing. You want to wait until your brass is stable before you start pulling it out. Now, this is partly why people, especially high-end precision rifle shooters, get so attached to their brass oftentimes. Because they know that the brass is very important in how it happens downrange, and also the amount of work that goes into, and the care and effort that goes into making this brass behave itself and manicuring this brass can be very extreme. And so they're right in that capacity. Yes, there's a lot of effort that goes into this. But we can't care more about the brass and the money we spend on it than we care about our performance that we can see downrange. And so if you haven't thought about this in the trimming op, the chances are good that you haven't thought about it in any other operation either. Trust yourselves, folks. If you're putting a uniform lube Let's try that again. If you're putting a uniform lube application on your brass and then you're resizing it and you feel one go in and it is like really tight. It's like, wow, that took a lot of force to resize that one, where these 30 I did prior to that didn't take that same amount of force. That's a clue, all right? Trust yourself. This is part of the reason why you want to run the best equipment that you can get your hands on. People oftentimes think that, well, this piece of equipment does the same thing as this piece of equipment. It's the same. It's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. No, that is not true. There's only certain equipment that you can run that will deliver the desired result. We live in a capitalist society, folks. That means, generally speaking, the more expensive thing is going to be the more capable thing. I know we hate that, but it doesn't change the fact that until we get into super frilly things that don't really matter, you can spend as much as you want on engraving on a rifle. You know, you can get a shotgun that's like $70,000, and at least $60,000 of that is the engraving that was done on it, right? But I'm talking about practical things here. Things that where the rubber meets the road. Generally speaking, the more expensive thing is going to have capabilities that the lesser things do not have. So there is right choices to make in this equipment. And while running the apex level equipment, you're generally going to be able to feel more of what's going on than you will in the less expensive, more clumsily designed and executed equipment. So trust yourself and trust your process and trust your ability to learn. And as long as you're really digging into and investing in the truth of what is going on in these operations, you'll be able to cull these cases that are problematic very easily in several different steps in your process, and trimming notwithstanding being one of the areas where you can detect cases that are not behaving metallurgically in the same way as the other cases in the batch. Now, since we're talking about equipment, I wanted to take a minute to address something that's been bothering me. Since I've been doing these episodes on brass trimming, I keep getting people that want me to vilify Henderson trimmers. For those of you that aren't aware, the Henderson trimmers are an automatic trimming tool that has a little twist lock collet type situation to hold the case, and then I believe it's a Forster trimming head with a pilot on it, and you twist lock it into the collet and ram it forward and it trims the cases. And because I have shared my desire to use Gerard trimmers or trimmers that do not have a pilot, a lot of commenters and a lot of folks that have called me have essentially been trying to get me to dirty talk Henderson trimmers. And I want to make something very, very clear. My choices are based around an entirely uncompromising desire for accuracy and precision. A degree of uncompromise that is not reasonable for a tremendous number of shooters. There's quite a lot of you out there that will not be served by listening to the majority of what I have to say, because you have so little time to devote to this discipline, and you get so few rounds fired every year. And even if you're a high volume shooter, you just don't get to spend the kind of time on it that I do. And you're not asking for the kind of accuracy and precision that I'm asking for. So this concept that I have some problem with Henderson trimmers, that I wish that they would get destroyed or something like that, there's a lot of you that really need to grow up out there. I have no bone to pick with Henderson. Point in fact, I don't know the guys there personally, but I've spoken with them before. I've ordered some of their products. I use some of their products on a daily basis. We use some of their products in our rifle builds. By all accounts, from what I've heard from anyone that's ever had one, is that they're a great company, a great bunch of people to deal with, and that their products are of high quality. So please do not misunderstand that my use of some other product automatically counts as a complete destruction of some other product. While in certain situations that may be true, that I don't like certain products and would never use or recommend them, there's a lot of people that would be greatly benefited by using and owning and purchasing a Henderson trimmer. Let me say that again for those of you that can't listen very well. There's a lot of you that would be benefited from owning a Henderson trimmer. There's quite a lot of things that are very innovative about the design of the Henderson trimmer, and I applaud them for coming out with something that's that unique. It's better than what a lot of other companies are doing, just copying everything under the sun and claiming that it's theirs. So at least the guys at Henderson were somewhat innovative, and I applaud them for that. And then too, if you're a heavy volume shooter and the third MOA to half MOA is really what you're after, and you're not looking for necessarily a whole lot better than that, it could be that the Henderson trimmer could be the best possible thing for you. Because there's no doubt in my mind, it is the fastest way to trim your brass. There is nothing that will even come close as far as the speed and ease at which you can trim brass. My work that I do on the Gerard trimmer is not as fast, not even close. It's more demanding on me as an operator to get the results that I want out of it than it would be for the majority of people that would use the Henderson. So if the Gerard trimmer didn't exist, I would absolutely be using a Henderson, because it's between the Gerard and the Henderson, they're the only two trimmers out there that I would even consider owning right now. Please, folks, just use your head when you're listening to my commentary, and understand that the shooters that I'm mentoring, the target audience for my content here, is the absolute apex of what's capable with precision rifles and hand loading equipment in the market today. I'm not necessarily counseling somebody that's okay with half MOA type performance, despite the fact that there's literally millions of you out there that would be ecstatic if they were shooting half MOA and no worse. Now, I also know that a lot of you that asked about the Henderson trimmer versus the Gerard trimmer and want my opinion on that, there's a lot of you that have presented your questions very respectfully, and I do appreciate that. As a Christian, I don't have an interest in demolishing other companies or their products. I really do not. There's enough room in this discipline for all of us to get along, and for all of us to use the various products in their respective places, because the vast majority of the equipment has some place in this industry. It might not be the place for you or for me or for the guy down the street, but somebody somewhere, it's the perfect thing for them. And the Henderson trimmer certainly qualifies as being one of those devices that absolutely has a place. And they're standing behind their products. They're helping their customers when they need help. And I can see that from a distance without having anything to do with the company. And they didn't talk to me about this. They didn't reach out. This is just something that I felt compelled as a Christian to talk about, because it's kind of a plague in the industry. People tend to get very polarized, and they tend to go on the attack. And this is especially true on forums, which, folks, I'm not even posting on forums this year. I mean, I'm straight giving it up this year. There's nothing but a bunch of childlike bullying and ridiculous behavior going on those things these days. It's just really sad, actually, to see the de-evolution of some of the great resources in this discipline. And of course, all of the modern social media is infected with this mindset as well. And so I would ask you to think for a moment about the kind of image that you would like portrayed of one of your products if you were an innovator in this discipline. I know that I don't like it when people talk nasty about my CPS, especially those that have never had one, don't know what it's for or who it's for, and immediately condemn it because they can't see a use for it in their own ecosystem. So be truthful and honest with yourself about the kind of shooter you are and the type of shooting you do, your goals in this discipline, and then choose the equipment that fits you best based on the facts of how that equipment performs and what you can expect. And there's myself and a number of other experts in this industry that would be happy to help you categorize which of these products is going to be the best fit for the kind of shooting that you do. Because I have recommended people buy the Henderson trimmer on a number of occasions based on the time and availability that they have, the kind of shooting that they're doing, and what's most important to them. The true mark of an expert in this industry is not someone that is polarizing and attacking other companies. It's realistically someone that is willing to properly categorize every product in a hierarchy in its proper place to be used with the exact use case that it was designed to do. Those types of qualifications take a tremendous amount of experience with all of the available gear. And the fact is, the majority of people that are placing products in a hierarchy simply haven't used enough of those products enough times for a long enough period of time to make any proclamations about where it should fit in a hierarchy. Folks, I don't mean this to come off as a scolding session here, but in the fourth part of this series, it should be evident by now that there are some very categorically huge differences between mindsets of how I would think about this when I'm chasing the absolute apex of precision and accuracy versus how a casual shooter would think about some of these things. Much of what I've had to say over the last 4 episodes just doesn't apply to anyone that's taking this all very casually. And the amount of performance that that casual shooter has at his fingertips today is greater than it's ever been in this industry. We really live in a blessed time as precision rifle shooters. And it's important that we remember that. The amount of unbelievable accuracy and precision that we can just purchase off the shelf, buy a great custom rifle and some really high quality dies and great components, good barrels, and high-end optics, and I mean, we can really lay down some impressive performances. And so the difference between third MOA, half MOA, anywhere in between that ballpark is you can just get there so easily these days. Everything that I'm talking about and instructing people on how to do is designed to do better than that. And you have to first decide that you even want that in order to even start trying to figure out how to get it. So have a good, honest talk with yourself. Ask yourself what kind of shooter you are, what is an acceptable level of accuracy and precision. If you're like me, then you'll know right away, because the answer is always more. Never will you be happy. You can shoot groups in the zeros and ones, and unless it's every single group you fire in the zeros, you probably won't be happy. And, in that, if your answer is just always more precision and accuracy, well, then you'll have a kindred spirit in me, and you make sure you stay subscribed to this channel.